In this video, I'm going to share 3 damage dealer builds with you for the Crystal Arena that I think are strong options for anyone that decides to queue solo. If you're looking for DPS options to play in a party, all of these builds will still be strong options and great additions to any group as long as it fits in the party's comp. Aside from going over the different builds and showing you what they are about, I'll also give you various tips on how to play each one of them, such as a layout of your rotation, which will hopefully contribute to more wins for you in the Crystal Arena. Starting with one of my favorite weapons when it comes to the competitive 5v5 scene in Albion Online, we're looking at the Light Crossbow. This is a ranged weapon that will allow you to deal massive damage from a distance and put a great amount of pressure on a target of your choice. Optimally, you want to focus the healer with this weapon so that they can't heal their teammates, and ideally you burst the healer down altogether and remove them from the battle. However, you shouldn't put yourself in a dangerous position just to reach the healer, so targeting any of the enemy damage dealers is a good choice as well. You want to prioritize the clot users as they have low defenses and are immensely vulnerable against the massive single target damage the Light Crossbow makes for. Focusing a more tanky target, such as a melee DPS that's in leather armor, is also a good decision as you still do great damage and force them back to their team for heals, by which you take a lot of pressure away from your own healer and your teammates. Although the ultimate on this weapon is an AoE and the primary ability explodes, making for even more AoE damage, it's all about picking out a target and pressuring them until they either flee or end up in base. To make all of this possible, however, you have to position yourself away from the enemy as you use clot yourself and are very squishy as well. You do have multiple defenses in this build that will help you survive, but once you've used those, you will be extremely vulnerable until the abilities are back up, which takes quite some time. On the Light Crossbow, take auto fire for your primary, which will be the main pressure in this build, and an ability that you want to keep spamming. Take Thundershot as your secondary, which is a massive pierce that will greatly reduce the resistances of your target. And for your ultimate, you have the Exploding Shot, which is an instant cast sticky bomb that deals a good chunk of damage after just a couple seconds. Ideally, you start off with auto fire into Exploding Shot, followed by an instant Thunder, after which you use auto fire twice more back to back. Since you have the well prepared passive, you get a reset on your primary ability every 4 attacks, which makes this rotation extremely powerful. However, you won't always be able to pull off this exact rotation, so understand that you want to spam your primary ability for pressure, that your secondary ability is a big armor pierce, and that you always want to use your sticky bomb in combination with the Thunder for maximum damage. For your defenses, you have the emergency shield on the Guardian helmet, which will grant you and allies near you a shield. Ideally, you hold on to this ability until you or someone you want to use this ability for is below 40% health, as the shield will be much bigger. The Mage Robe makes for the Purging Shield, which increases your resistances, but more importantly, removes all buffs of enemy players that damage you. So whenever you get targeted, consider if there are buffs on the enemy that you wish to remove, and if positive, activate your Purging Shield. For your only mobility in this build, you have the Royal Shoes, which makes for the evasive jump ability that allows you to leap towards targeted position whilst becoming immune to damage, debuffs, and crowd control until you land. My recommendation would be to use your Royal Shoes defensively, unless you're very sure that you won't put yourself in danger. Only activate your Mage Robe if you get hard focused by targets with buffs, and hold on to your Guardian helmet as much as possible. For your consumable, you have the Resistance Potion, which is ideal to use whenever you get targeted by multiple enemies to reduce the massive amount of damage you're about to take. These 2 for food to increase your damage, and with that, your overall pressure. So if you want to play a ranged damage dealer that had a place in the competitive 5v5 scene for the longest time, one that deals massive damage and puts a lot of pressure on any target in the enemy team, you may want to try out this Light Crossbow build. The second build that's very strong in the Crystal Arena features the Demonfang. If you've already done some Crystal Arenas, without a doubt you've already seen your fair share of Demonfangs in this game mode. And with a good reason, because this weapon is absolutely busted for this type of content. There are multiple ways you can build around the Demonfang, with players running anything from clot to plate armors. But sharing all of that would be too much, so I want to share my favorite build for the Demonfang, which I have enormous success with in this content. I like to play the Demonfang as a bruiser, which is why I stick to the Hylian jacket that makes for medium defenses and the lifesteal aura. This way I can stay in the fight and keep the pressure up without the need to run out of the fight every time I need to wait for cooldowns. Now this build is all about buffing yourself up with the various damage modifiers you have in your build and unleashing your damage at the right moment with Blood Ritual, which is the ultimate ability of the Demonfang. This ability has a unique mechanic to it in which you can cast it up to 3 times in succession, with the third cast dealing damage over time to yourself, aside from dealing damage to your enemies. So you have to be a bit careful with using your ultimate, as the maximum potential will start harming yourself. You can get your ultimate off 1 or 2 times without getting punished, so sometimes it's a good idea to hold on from going all in and just using your ultimate as a tool of pressure. As for all the damage modifiers which play a major part in this build, these come from the Deadly Swipe on your primary, Throwing Blades on your secondary, your Musak offhand, your food, which is the beef stew, and finally the Defenseless Rush on your Royal Sandals. The ideal rotation to get your buffs up before you start unleashing Blood Ritual is to get 3 stacks of Deadly Swipe first and then activate your boots, followed by Throwing Blades, where the more targets you hit, the more damage bonus you get, and then spam your ultimate on as many targets as possible. You can also single a target out and hard focus just one person, but more often than not, you'll gain more value hitting as many targets as possible because it will make for a much bigger pressure on the entire enemy team. Speaking about pressure, I like to use the Assassin Hood with this build, which reduces your cooldowns by 15 seconds if you get a full channel in. This will reset your Throwing Blades and Blood Ritual, which will allow you to pull the damage rotation off twice in a short time frame, which is a massive amount of damage. The only exception to the second rotation is the ability on your boots, so it's up to you whether you use your boots in the first rotation or in the second one. For sustain, you have the Lifesteal Aura on the Hylian jacket with this build, which you want to use when you are about 40% health, as the lower you are, the more value you get out of it. You also have the Resistance Potion for when you get targeted by multiple players, and since you are a melee, you will be in the middle of the fight and take quite some damage, so the Resistance Potion will help reduce that. And finally, since you're using a lot of abilities and even reset these with the Assassin Hood, I like to run a Limb Escape to have the energy sustain covered as well. In prolonged fights, you will have energy issues with this build, especially since you are using the Musak, which increases your energy cost. So you definitely need some energy sustain with the Demonfang. If you like the idea of playing a damage dealer that's constantly up in the enemy team's face, putting immense pressure on the entire enemy team, you will enjoy playing this Demonfang build. The next build I want to share with you has been very popular in the Crystal Arena ever since this content was added to the game. With the new update that introduced the Crystal Arena, the fire staves got reworked as well. And aside from visual updates, they also received new secondary abilities, and one of them even had its ultimate ability changed altogether. That one being the Infernal Staff, which now has an ultimate ability that leaves a trail behind your target, which does damage every half a second, and silences anyone that stands on it. Combined with the new secondary ability all fire staves now have, called Flame Blast, the Infernal Staff creates a huge amount of chaos in any battlefield it finds itself a part of. As far as the build goes, you want to have the Royal Cowl as your helmet, which reduces your energy cost to 0 for 15 seconds every time you activate it. The Infernal Staff is extremely energy hungry, so you simply want to activate this ability every time it's off cooldown. For your armor, you have the Cleric Robe, which will grant you the Everlasting Spirit Shield when hit upon activation, that makes you immune for a few seconds, while simultaneously increasing your damage. Although the Infernal Staff does have some range to it, depending on the abilities you decide to take on it, you may find yourself closer to the battle sometimes than you'd ideally want to be. So this buff will come in very handy when enemies decide to target you, or when you need to take that extra step towards the fight to reach your targets. Aside from the defensive on your Cleric Robe, you also have the Resistance Potion as a second defense, which by now should be obvious is the go-to potion for any damage dealer in the Crystal Arena. Then you have the Royal Shoes, which are great to reposition yourself out of danger, whilst also making you immune to damage, debuffs and crowd control. Keep in mind, this is your only form of mobility in this build, so try to refrain from using it aggressively. As far as damage dealing goes with the Infernal staff, you have multiple options when it comes to selecting your primary and secondary abilities. The combination I like to run is Firebolt for my primary and Flame Blast for my secondary. Firebolt in combination with the aggressive caster passive makes for a huge amount of single target damage. Literally anyone you decide to target with this ability will melt down real quick. You also have the Morgana cape in this build, so once you activate your ultimate, you will be able to cast your Firebolt even faster for a full 8 seconds, which will make for an enormous amount of DPS. For the secondary, I like to take Flame Blast because it's instant, has a low cooldown, and makes for AoE damage, and with that, even more pressure throughout the fight. If you feel like this combination of primary and secondary isn't ideal, and you'd like to have more range to your build, you can also go for Burning Field on your primary, along with Fire Artillery as your secondary. If you do that, I would recommend changing your cape to Martlock, as you won't benefit as much from the Morgana cape with this combination of abilities. If you like the idea of adding Fiery Chaos to the fights in the Crystal Arena, this build does a huge amount of damage and is definitely worth trying. I hope you like one of these builds and wish you good luck in the Crystal Arena. If you haven't checked my Crystal Arena guide, I recommend you do that next, as I share various tips on how to climb the ladders in this content.